Uh, Jack Whitcomb, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
And thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and we're here to talk about a very important issue. So, what do you think? Is it true that most Americans live paycheck to paycheck where their situation is so dire that they wouldn't be able to meet like $1,000 emergency expense? Because if that's true, that sounds like things are really tough for working class Americans these days.
Mm. The claim that Bernie Sanders and many of his adherents repeat over and over again, and this has been done to death, so I'm just repeating something that plenty of other people have said, is that 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. That claim comes from a survey by a financial technology company who will not reveal their methodology. It's probably not a particularly representative sample. It's not clear what wording they used, and it's not clear in the first place what paycheck to paycheck even means. I mean, we would like to start with a very precise definition, like, you have $1,000 in your savings or whatever. Um, but sadly, human language in general does not lend itself well to specificity much of the time. Uh, Now, if you rely on Federal Reserve Survey data, then the typical American, like the median, uh, usually has a fair amount in their savings accounts. So, I think that probably the fair way to say it is that the typical American is pretty wealthy compared to the rest of the world, and they do have money to cover, if I remember, a month at least of their basic expenses, things like rent and food. So I don't think that it's accurate to say that the typical American lives paycheck to paycheck. But it's also not really the relevant measure in the first place, I think, because you could be somebody making very little money and saving a fair amount every month, and you have a lot saved. Um, or you could be somebody who's making a lot of money, but you live in a very expensive area and you're constantly spending tons of money on rent, and maybe you don't even know how to make food cheaply at home, and so you're constantly eating out, and then you wind up living paycheck to paycheck even though you're exorbitantly wealthy. So I don't think that it's the right measure in the first place.
All right. What about the idea that most Americans would not be able to live off of the federal minimum wage? Like there are some people that say that if
Hmm.
you lived off of the federal minimum wage, you would just be in poverty and that you wouldn't afford to eat. Do you think that that's a correct claim?
It's not literally true. I think that the typical American eats in a way where if they made the federal minimum wage and then they had to try to cover their other expenses, then they wouldn't be able to do it. But that's just because the typical American isn't really trying to get to the bare minimum and see how much it really takes, and it's not a lot. In my post on this subject, I was actually kind of generous in the first version, and I started by trying to describe a relatively okay standard of living because I didn't want to immediately go to, oh, okay, like, well, what's the cost of like rice and beans and, maybe some vitamin pills or something in order to try to like just literally stay physically alive. Um, but if we go to the true bare minimum, then I don't know, maybe you find some roommates to live with, you find a place that goes for like $2,000 a month, and then you're each paying 500. But like the true, real bare minimum would be no housing at all. You're living on the streets, you sleep in a tree or something, you just hide from people, or you go to a homeless shelter, you beg, maybe you, in the post, the updated version, I added the example of just finding a piece of metal scrap, like a bowl, maybe in a junkyard, and you fill it up with water and you make a fire with a lighter you bought from Walmart. Just all sorts of insane stuff that you could do just to physically stay alive, which is really not that hard of a thing to do relative to what most Americans do. And my mother actually replied to my post, and she really did not understand the concept that I was getting at. She thought, oh, but what about clothing? Oh, how could you afford clothing after all this? Um, it's really hard to get people thinking about what it really means to just literally be surviving. I mean, you wouldn't be spending money on new clothes regularly. You would have whatever clothes you have right now. And if you literally just start from nothing, you could go to a dump. You could, maybe with like a very small amount of money, you could just go to a thrift store and then you would just have one pair of clothes that you never wash and you smell awful all the time. Uh, yeah, who knows? So there's the true bare minimum is way lower than people imagine.
I mean, the bare minimum you're describing sounds like a really terrible life that no one would ever
Yes, it
want.
is. It's horrible, and I don't think that anybody should have to live like that ever. Certainly not in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. So like, there's a quote from your article where you said, "The federal minimum wage, despite being pitifully small, is enough to live on. It would be easier to like this requires some painful assumptions about how one is willing to live, but it is indeed living." So like. You said that you were being generous in your article. Maybe let's not put the cart before the horse. Explain the experiment you gave in the article where you're not just like some hobo that's living in like a metal box that never
Yeah.
never never buys clothing and just that that sounds just completely awful. Let's
It
let's
would be really awful. Yes,
let,
no.
let's stick with the more generous and slightly less awful experiment from your article that is still not pleasant, but at least does not make me want to vomit.
Yes. So if you look at the absolute cheapest places you can live, it's probably the easiest ones to find. Although this is actually still a little bit more expensive, but this is the one that I use for an example. After initially starting with like a $1,000 a month place in Chicago, you can find a place that goes for $800 a month in Long Beach, California. And that same website I found that place on, you can find similarly priced apartments to live in all sorts of places. Um, and that's not going to be the worst. I mean, you'll probably have like air conditioning and a functioning dishwasher, an oven, things like that, or maybe just a microwave. But that's much better than nothing. It's much better than just being a homeless person. And let's see, once you're paying $800 a month, you still have a lot left over. You're going to be claiming the full SNAP benefit of $250 a month.
Wait, sorry.
And
Explain what the SNAP benefit is.
yes, SNAP. So, if you aren't poor in America, this might be new to you. You might not know exactly how SNAP works, but if you are below a certain income threshold, depending upon how many people you're living with, then you get to claim a SNAP EBT card from the government, which is like, it's like a credit card that the government pays for you, and you get a certain sum of money to spend on food, and you can only spend it on food. That's the only thing you can spend it on. And the funny thing is, I discovered when doing my calculations that if you're making meals as cheaply as possible in a slow cooker, and these are actually pretty good meals, I'll get to that in a moment, you don't wind up using the full SNAP benefit of like roughly $250 a month. It winds up being less than that because you're making meals that are like, $3.50 a meal, and you're eating oatmeal for breakfast. I actually had oatmeal with raisins for breakfast this morning. That's like the kind of like really cheap meal you can have all the time. And so your daily expense on food is going to be about $8.50, which doesn't take you to the full SNAP benefit. And you can go lower than that too. And these slow cooker meals that I make, they're pretty nice. It's not like eating just beans and rice, cooked very painfully every day. You get to add spices, which are relatively cheap because you only need to add a small amount to add some flavor. Um, I did recommend removing broth to reduce expenses, but you can have chicken broth in there. That's technically possible depending upon how you manage your other expenses. And then you can add, red kidney beans and chicken and white onion in there. You'll need a knife, but that's just a one-time expense, so it like really turns into a very small amount in the long run. Um, so it's really not the worst. And then once you've had, you got food, you have shelter. It's not the absolute worst. It's just it really sucks because you have to keep in mind in the budget that I was describing, there's no eating out. You do not even get to go to McDonald's. Like if you like eating like a cheeseburger at McDonald's from time to time, there's no eating out because that's slightly more expensive. And so if you really want to live on the federal minimum wage, you're not going to be ever going out to like eat sushi or something. So it's really it's not great, but it is better than the situation that I started by describing in this episode.
Um, so maybe like when I hear people, they could be politicians, they could be ordinary people saying that like the federal minimum wage is something that like it's like a starvation wage. You wouldn't be able to live off of it. I think that the subtext, like this is sometimes subtext, but this is often just explicit text. Is that they're trying to argue that the federal minimum wage should be much higher. So maybe they are making claims. They might they're making claims about the degree of survivability on the federal minimum wage that you might agree with and you might disagree with, but you would agree that the purpose for why they're advocating for that is because they want the federal minimum wage to go up, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And ironically, I think that that would be a good thing. I mean, it depends upon implementation and exactly how high you set it. Uh, if I had to recommend, I mean, like usually when economists talk about this, they'll recommend instead of just having one federal minimum wage, you set it to, let's say, half of the median wage in each county or some other well-defined area. And that allows you to deal with things like, well, essentially, labor productivity is a lot lower in rural areas than in urban areas. And so if you were to set the same minimum wage in both, like if you took the minimum wage in like Portland, Oregon, and you set that in like more rural areas, the effects on employment, you would expect those to be a lot stronger. And that's just the essential problem with the minimum wage, which of course economists repeatedly try to drill into people, which is that the real minimum wage that employers have to pay you is $0. They don't have to pay you at all. They don't have to hire you at all. And if the minimum wage is set higher than what they think somebody is worth, then they're not going to hire them. Now, empirically, when we look at minimum wage laws being enacted and we try to compare them to a plausible counterfactual situation, like Aaron Dube, for example, has done work comparing places like across state lines, state borders. You'll have like one county where the minimum wage is higher, and then a neighboring county in another state where it's lower, and then you can use that to try to isolate the effect on employment. The employment effects tend to be pretty small. It depends on the meta-analysis you look at, but the general like consensus-ish opinion is something like the effect is negative, but it's pretty close to zero. It's not that harsh. And so overall, you'd expect it to be more helpful than harmful. Um, but returning to the discussion of, is the federal minimum wage high enough to live on? And how, people are kind of playing fast and loose with the truth about that. Um, it's hard because I know that people are supporting something that I kind of want to happen. I think would be kind of would be a good thing, but I don't want to lie to do it. I don't want to mislead people to do it. I don't think that we should. And I don't think we need to. I think that's a little cynical.
So I think that you're making two separate points at the same time. One is that people are lying when they say that the federal minimum wage is a starvation wage and that you
Yes.
wouldn't be able to live off of it. Like they're lying and that you could easily live off of it if you tried. So that's the first point you're making. And I think the second point you're making is that people are not being entitled when they argue for a higher federal minimum wage. You want the federal minimum wage to go up, but like for different reasons than like those people who say that like the federal minimum wage needs to be higher so that people can just live at all. Is that correct?
Depending on the implementation, again, I mean, there is one guy in Congress made headlines recently because he was arguing or introducing a bill to raise the federal minimum wage to $25 an hour, uh, which I think would be a disastrous policy in many places. Not everywhere. In many locations, that wouldn't be as harsh, but in a lot of places and for a lot of people, I think that'd be really bad. Um, if you're looking at, somebody who's getting paid $14 an hour at some service job, they're going to keep getting paid that amount if if they're actually adding $25 an hour or more to the firm by working there, and they're being underpaid by that much, which is a huge difference. There's a huge gap between $25 an hour and $14 an hour. And so just think for a second. If that gap is real, and there's some other firm who can see that they're being paid or underpaid by quite a lot, and like they know that like if they were to hire them, they'd be adding a huge amount to their firm, so that's really profitable, then they could pull them in even by just offering $20 an hour, and they would still be making a huge profit.
How much money do you personally feel like you would need to live like a comfortable life by your standards?
A comfortable life by my standards. I think that I'm pretty close right now to what feels like a comfortable life. I could probably do a little bit less. So if I run the numbers on that, ooh, I mean, the thing is, this is important to keep in mind. I already have inherited a lot from my parents because they paid for a lot of things for me. So, like, I already have this electric bike. and I already have, excuse me, this laptop and a whole lot of other things that I've just been given, and all of my clothing and things like that. And so that reduces what I need in the future in order to have a comfortable life. Um, Accounting for that would be hard, but if we just focus on new expenses, that'd be pretty low. I could probably get in an even smaller apartment than this one. But if we just use that number, that's $1,200 a month plus 600 for food. Um, I could probably do like, $2,000 a month after taxes. That'd probably be enough for me to be happy. Which is that's like $24,000 a year. I don't know how much that would be before taxes, how much I would need to get that amount, but yeah, pretty low. I'm a pretty low standards guy. Maybe that distorts my view a bit of how much other people need in order to feel happy. But again, the whole point that I was making wasn't that, oh, you don't really need all that much. It's that you should be comfortable asking for more in a way that doesn't involve misleading or lying to people in any way.
Yeah, okay. Maybe that ties into something that you've mentioned in your article where you say Americans feel deeply ashamed of their desires.
Mm.
Reality says that you only need the federal minimum wage to survive, but people want more. The only way to communicate this in a way that feels socially acceptable is to convert your desires into the language of impoverishment and struggle.
Mm.
Could you talk about this a little bit?
So it's kind of just a theory. I see people on Substack pontificating and theorizing about culture and things like that all the time. And so I thought, I don't have to be like super rigorous when I'm talking about this. And I think that this is a fun, interesting idea that might be true. Um, but I was being maybe a little bit too confident in my assessment. But I do think that there's some truth to it. That uh, people just feel like if they were to say, oh, I can afford the things that I need in life, but I think that it's unfair that I don't get more. That just doesn't sound very socially acceptable. And another thing, it's not just that it's not totally socially acceptable. I think that part of it that I didn't mention is that people have kind of developed a strategy for talking about this that allows them to avoid a kind of pincer attack from conservatives, a rhetorical pincer attack where they say, oh, you're just envious, or you're just jealous, you need to work harder, ththings like that.
All
You
right,
need to somehow
give me an example of this that you may have seen.
like somebody will like say, we need to do this or that government intervention in order to help people, like, increasing funding for Medicaid or like implementing the ACA Medicaid expansion in Texas or something like that. And then just say, the only reason why you're asking for this is because you're lazy. The people who need these things just need to work harder. They deserve what they're getting. And if you really work hard in America, you'll be rewarded for it. Um, there's a very strong sense of that among a large share of the public that really you're pretty much getting what you deserve, whatever it is you're being paid on the market. And although it's funny, I don't have a complete explanation for why a lot of these people believe that because there's a missing piece, kind of a contradiction, where they actually are willing to accept environmental, external explanations for why people are poor, but only in the context of things like international trade. Like, usually you won't see more conservative commentators pointing to external environmental factors explaining somebody's poor circumstances. But in that particular context, interestingly, they're much more willing to accept that kind of explanation and say, oh, this isn't the fault of these coal miners or these manufacturing workers. It's the fault of global elites and globalization and free traders and liberals and Bill Clinton and NAFTA and so on and so on.
Okay. Um, so let's say that like there's an exception when it comes to free trade, but in general, when someone is poor, conservatives are more likely to think that like it was their choice and it was their responsibility and they are responsible for the fact that they are poor. And that's part of the reason why maybe conservatives are more opposed to raising the minimum wage, that they think that this is a case of deservedness. Like we if we raise the minimum wage, we'll be giving too much money to people who don't deserve it.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, they've also heard, more economically oriented explanations of why we shouldn't raise the minimum wage, which, it's very hard to figure out the exact motivations of people because people deploy a huge number of different arguments for things, and they'll pick up and use any argument that tells them what they want to hear. And so then the question is, okay, which one of these particular arguments was like the original one that they heard and that like really anchored them to this? Or does that even matter? Because really it's probably emotional impulses that explain a lot of political opinions and strongly held beliefs that people have rather than intellectual ideas that they got attached to and they thought, oh, on reflection, this makes a lot of sense. Because most people just don't spend that much time thinking about things, which is, I don't say that like to be mean to like the typical person or to be an elitist. I think that that's perfectly normal and healthy. I don't think that everybody should be spending as much time as I do or any economist does thinking about these sorts of things.
So you're saying like most people don't actually spend that much time thinking about these types of economic concepts that you are thinking about. Like even the concept of like what trade-offs would be necessary to live off of a federal minimum wage. Most people don't think about that in the way that you do.
No, and I think that even questions where the real answer is just a Google search away, most people don't bother. They don't. A very common one is, oh, did living standards decline from the 1970s or the 1950s to today? Like, has there been wage stagnation since then? It's just a Google search away. If you just Google right now, like, are wages higher than they were in the 1970s, then Google, they have an AI now that will just tell you, yes, they're higher. And even if you adjust for inflation, and even if it's the median wage, and the median income is higher, and yada, yada, yada. But most people won't even bother to do that because it just doesn't matter all that much to the typical person. Emotional impulses matter a lot more on very relatively simple ideas about the world, and I think that that's perfectly fine. I'm not like trying to bang on about how stupid people are. I think that most people shouldn't be spending too much time thinking about these things because if everyone in the world was an economist, then well, we wouldn't have any food and we wouldn't have any cars or anything like that. So specialization, even when it comes to knowledge, is important.
Yeah, otherwise, and if you didn't mention the whole thing about how it's fine, maybe there would be some people listening who would think, oh, you're just trying to shame people for being lazy slobs who lack self-discipline.
Yeah, no, I don't think that people should feel ashamed or anything like that. I actually, if you get into it with me, I've kind of weird views about free will. Well, not weird among philosophers.
Okay, we're too, like, this discussion about free will feels like it belongs in another conversation, or at least
okay.
like,
Let's
not,
avoid that. I don't want to
yeah.
get into that too much.
Like I brought you on to talk about the cost of living and not like this, not give me like an existential crisis about free will.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not your job right now.
No, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking back to like the necessary amount of money that someone would need in order to live a comfortable life, or like a life where they're not just some random hobo living in a metal box where they never buy any clothing. Yeah. So to quote your article again, can people put in a little bit of effort in order to minimize their living expenses in the way I've described? In theory, yes. In practice, you need an important skill that some people might not have: the ability to think about income and expenses over the long term. So it seems like here you're saying that like most people don't actually have the cognitive ability to think about income and expenses over the long term, and that's why they think that the federal minimum wage is a starvation wage. Am I reading you correctly?
I wasn't saying that that's why they think that it's a starvation wage. I was saying that that's why it might literally be a starvation wage in certain cases. Because if you just do not have the ability to figure this out, maybe it really would be impossible for you to get by. But it's not literally impossible in the sense of like, oh, like even if you had perfect information about the world and like, or being really rational, you'd be able to do this.
It's cognitively impossible.
Yeah, it might be just cognitively impossible. There might be people who make very little money and they just genuinely can't figure out how to use that money better. And if you were to put somebody smarter in their shoes, they might be able to manage their finances better. There's a reason why, like I've always thought it's ridiculous to hire a financial advisor. Like, what would I even need that for? But there's some people where that might actually be helpful because they just can't figure it out. And let me give you another example. I had to spend a lot of time trying to get my twin sister, and I adore her. I love my twin sister, Kate. But I had to spend a lot of time trying to get her to set up an account that she can use to buy stock and to buy ETFs so that she can build money for retirement. And like it's really important to start early. And like I had to repeatedly like explain this and like push her and like, hey, have you done this yet? Like, have you actually opened an account? And she's like, oh, but I don't know how to do it. And like, you need to help me and things like that. And it's just so surprising to me when this happens. Not only that so many people don't know to do it and like never like find out that they should do it, but also that it's hard for them to even just work with an online system to set up an account in the first place. So there are all these like surprising differences to me, and I'm not bragging. I mean, there are certainly things that I can't do that other people can do, but in this particular area of managing money, I just seem to often not realize that there are things that other people just don't know how to do, and I don't blame them for that. Everybody has differences in ability, and I think that it's really unfortunate, and I think that people really deserve help in those matters sometimes.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you're not humble bragging about your
I'm
intelligence.
not. No, no, no. I mean, whenever we're talking about this sort of thing, I want to be honest about it. I think that to avoid humble bragging, I have to think of something that I'm really bad at.
All right, but
Remembering names.
make it brief so that it doesn't derail the conversation.
Okay, I won't derail it too much. Remembering names and like basic conversational skills. Oh, who would have guessed that this guy is bad at social skills? But yeah, no. So everybody has their own abilities, and there's differences in that, and lots of variation. I don't blame people for things like that. I try not to take too much pride in my own. I think it's just important to try to have respect and show understanding to people.
Yeah, but so like going back to the topic of like you ran that experiment of what it would take to live off of the federal minimum wage. There were tons of like tricks you employed, like understanding SNAP eligibility and exactly how much money you would get from the welfare program of SNAP, or like figuring out the cheapest apartment you could rent that would still be comfortable, or understanding the nature of the slow cooker and all of the cheapest ingredients that you could haul into the slow cooker. Like it it made perfect sense because I like you and I are a member of what someone like Joseph Heath would refer to as the cognitive elite. So like yeah, no,
I
I
don't
know
want.
that
I don't want.
let me explain myself. So like
It's like it's true, but he shouldn't say it.
last year I did a podcast about populism, about like why people are attracted to like political messaging that seems a lot more intuitively true. I've already quoted this multiple times on my podcast, but I'm going to quote it again. I'm going to quote his article like for like the third time. People are not rebelling against economic elites, but rather against cognitive elites. Narrowly construed, it is a rebellion against executive function. More generally, it is a rebellion against modern society, which requires the ceaseless exercise of cognitive inhibition and control in order to evade exploitation, marginalization, addiction, and stigma. Elites have basically rigged all of society so that increasingly one must deploy the cognitive skills possessed by elites to successfully navigate the social world. For example, try opening a bank account, renting an apartment, or obtaining a tax refund without engaging in analytical processing. Like the analytical processing that comes a lot more naturally to members of the cognitive elite. So the examples that he gave of opening a bank account, obtaining a tax refund, or renting an apartment that are like extremely cognitively draining, you did two of those things in your experiment. One would be obtaining a tax refund because SNAP is a welfare program that's basically a tax refund. And the second thing would be renting an apartment. Those are two things where like even if they don't cost money to do research about, they are very cognitively draining, and that's why for a lot of people they don't understand, like they don't have the necessary cognitive skills to live off of a federal minimum wage. Like what would you say to that?
In college, I took a class called Poverty and Culture, taught by the wonderful Professor Curtin at American University. And one of the things that we were taught about is that even when there are welfare programs available to help people, the application process can be so demanding and difficult and complicated that people eligible for those programs don't receive them.
Because
And
those welfare programs were created by the cognitive elite. They were
yeah,
created by people like us who can do these extremely complicated calculations to figure out whether we're eligible. Because we're not
yeah,
starving. Because we're not starving. And like, if we were starving, then it would be a lot harder for us to do these complex calculations in the first place.
yeah, it could be. Yeah, I mean, starvation, especially starvation early in life, or like just even just like not getting enough calories, even if you're not literally starving, can be really damaging in the long term on somebody's cognitive abilities. Um, for the most part, although in the U.S. context, I don't know how relevant that is because for the most part, even the poorest Americans aren't starving. A lot of them are overweight and grow up overweight because just it's a lot easier to access food here in the U.S.
But
And
they're still not a member of the cognitive elite.
yes, and because there's just differences in abilities among people.
Yeah,
But
like you were someone who wrote an entire article about like what like these people are completely lying and these people are like full of it when they say that like you can't live off of a federal minimum wage while you're doing all of these complex like extremely cognitively burdensome calculations about like the best apartment to rent and like how to like obtain this tax refund that many people in poverty don't actually get even if they're eligible for them.
yeah, yeah, no. I mean, yeah, a lot of that they just might not be able to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so, um, so I think this is another thing that you wrote in your article that was pretty interesting when you said, I come from a wealthy family and willingly subject myself to extremely cheap meals, partly because I want to prove a point, and partly because I like the feelings of pride and accomplishment that come with being exceptionally efficient. Anyone could do this. End quote. Do you believe that it is irrational that other people don't willingly subject themselves to extremely cheap meals because then they can't invest as much in index funds and then like
No,
they'll
no,
retire
it's
the
it's
late.
not it's not irrational. It's just a difference in preferences. Could doesn't mean will. There are plenty of people for whom, um, oh, I mean, it depends on how you define rational. I mean, we talk about that we talk about that word as if we all had this common definition in mind. In certain contexts in economics, rational is just going to mean, oh, you have complete and transitive preferences, and that's it. Which isn't what most people think of. They're also thinking of like, oh, you're considering all available information and you're using it correctly in some sense. You're considering the full costs and benefits of a decision. You're thinking about
You're the
opportunity
rational
cost.
actor model that they teach like people in Econ 101.
Yeah, I mean, because that really changes. I mean, like we talk about it as like it's one thing, but in many contexts, we're going to be talking about a rational actor with much more minimal assumptions about how they behave. For example, there was a paper that I was looking at. Um, okay, this is actually just an example of like economists thinking about, what might be construed as quote unquote irrationality. Um, there was a paper I was reading. I think it was called, oh, what was it? Something Unconstrained by Peter Maxted. And he was talking about how we can model behavior where people are discounting benefits that they don't get instantly, and trying to account for the fact that, for example, if you ask people like when they're hungry, do you want to receive the Snickers bar or do you want the apple? People are going to be more likely to receive to ask for the Snickers bar because it's an unhealthy choice, but they really like it. Whereas if you ask them, what do you want given to you 1 week from now? Suddenly they're like, oh, I want the apple because I want to be healthy. Because it's a lot easier to make a more quote unquote rational, whatever that means in this context, decision when you're not receiving the costs and benefits immediately. And so people make what we can call irrational decisions about, the long run by, for example, failing to invest right now, rather than waiting until they're already in their 40s and there's not as much time to accrue, compounded gains in the stock market, and other things like that. And also just, healthy eating in general, and like unhealthy eating can be well explained by the fact that people are very bad at thinking about costs and benefits for their next self in the future. They're not thinking about how, their bad habits right now are going to turn into a problem later. They're not really thinking about it. They know it, but they're not going to react to that information and that outcome in the same way that they would if it were immediate. Like imagine how somebody would behave if, for example, too much sugar can cause acne. Imagine how teenagers would behave if whenever they ate too much sugar, they immediately developed white pimples on their face. They would hate sugar, they would avoid it, and they would eat like a more optimal amount. But if you just delay it a bit, like, the effects come out later, like maybe like a week or two later, based on what you were eating in the past, then suddenly people are like, oh, I'm getting all this acne. What am I supposed to do? And then rather than switching to a healthier diet that would fix the problem, people turn to all sorts of fixes that don't always work, but sometimes they do. And I'm glad that these innovations exist, like a something acid. I haven't used it in a while. It's like those foams that you can put on your face. But the most effective way to get rid of your acne, I discovered fairly recently, is just to eat really healthy. I eat like a lot less processed food nowadays, and what do you know? Now all the acne's gone.
Yeah. So maybe let's go to the whole thing about like humans sometimes act irrationally.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think is very demonstrably true is that in general, like even if you adjust for inflation, Americans feel like they need a much higher wage to live these days compared to how they did in the past. Like obviously there's that infamous article that you linked about how like for a family of four, like they would say the poverty line is $140,000 a year. But like even ignoring that article in general, people have much higher expectations about how much money they would need in order to live well compared to in the past. Do you think that that is a rational decision?
I don't think it has anything to do with rationality. I think that this, and now, like, see, I'm being nitpicky. Maybe I'm being a bit nitpicky about language. I think that if you just strongly prefer a life that involves certain material comforts, there's nothing irrational about that. It'd be irrational if you preferred a life like that, and then you kept making decisions that didn't make any sense. Like, imagine if, like, you could get a college degree that pays off really well. Like you go to the University of Oregon, it's relatively inexpensive, and you pay some amount of money now, and you give up the money you could be earning during that period in order to get more money later. It would be irrational if you looked at all that and you saw that like you would benefit more from that than it would hurt, and you thought, I'm not going to do that. And then like later on, like years later, you're just complaining about like how much your life sucks. But for the most part, I think that people are being rational given their own preferences when they choose not to go to college. I think that the typical person who chooses not to go to college is doing that because, the machinery in their brain, however that works, we don't really know, is designed such that they just care a lot more about the short term than the long term. And that's not really irrational, because that would imply that they're not applying themselves in a way that conforms to their preferences. Their preferences are real. And economists mostly just want to talk about, like, okay, given those preferences, how are people going to behave? There's not as much commentary on, like, what preferences should you have? Like, should you prefer, like, this other thing?
So I think that a lot of the time, with the rise of social media, it has become a lot more ubiquitous for people to compare themselves with other people. Like you use social media for like mindless scrolling on X to get like economic ideas or whatnot. Maybe a lot of the time, if someone were to use Instagram or TikTok, they would constantly be comparing themselves with other people. They would see other people who have a lot more followers and a lot more likes than them, and they would see how glamorous their apartments are or how high quality the food they eat is, and maybe that would shape their perception of how much money they need to live an affordable life or like a life where they are respected by their peers or whatnot. So maybe to what extent do you think relative status comparisons, like people comparing how much status they have with their in groups on Instagram or whatnot, to what extent do you think those serve as an explanatory factor for why people think that the cost of living has gone up?
Hmm. It probably matters somewhat. I don't know to what degree. And I don't want to comment too much on the issue. I'll talk about like my suspicions and like what I think is going on, but I know that there's a lot of evidence and careful examinations of and this leads into like the vibe session discourse, like why is sentiment so much lower than you would expect it to be. Um, I don't totally know. I think that it probably matters. I think that social media has probably been kind of a net bad for society and for people in general. But once you have everybody on it, it's hard for any individual to get off of it because other people are on it, and like sometimes you just won't even know what your friends are up to, or like like what's going on unless you're on there, and so it's hard to pivot away from it. And yeah, I think that it's probably not very good for you to be seeing, the lifestyles of the rich and the famous, as that one song goes, and comparing yourself all the time. Oh, Mike, there we go.
Maybe another secondary effect is that the stuff one thing that you would say is that it is okay for people to want more than they need. Like it is okay for the people to say the federal minimum wage should go up, not because people need it on to survive, but like it's okay for people to want more so that they could afford a better car or like a better e-bike, or like so that they could afford to go out like to eat at least once a week or something like that. Like
Yeah.
you would agree with me there. So maybe something here is that like a lot of the time when people say that they need more money to survive because of like in order to keep up with the Joneses or whatnot, maybe they're taking stuff that they used to perceive as a want, and they're turning it into a perceived need. Would you agree there?
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah. So maybe are you familiar with the concept of the hedonic treadmill?
Yes, I am.
All right, could you explain that to our audience?
So, the hedonic treadmill. It's a concept in psychology that essentially says that no matter what, if you move to a higher living standard, let's say that you get a raise and you get maybe you can get like a mansion and like a Lamborghini or something. Eventually, you're going to return back to the baseline of your happiness. And it's not the absolute level of consumption, for example, that determines your happiness, but the fluctuations in it. And this goes all the way back to thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, I think, wrote about how what really makes people happy isn't being in first place in the race of life. It's constantly moving ahead of other people. Um, Speaking as somebody who runs a lot and has done races, I actually I agree even in that literal context of running a race. It's a lot more fun to be like getting ahead of people over and over again than it is to just be running really fast and be ahead of everybody else.
Yeah. So maybe let's say that someone gets a new car, they love it, and then after a few weeks they adapt to it because they got their wants until they it stopped being novel for them, and then they just perceived it as like another facet of their life.
Yes.
So a lot of the time, the stuff that we perceive as needs, like access to clean water and a roof over our heads, and like never feeling like we're going to starve with the money that we currently have. A lot of the stuff that we perceive as needs are things that we don't have as much of we don't feel as much of an impulse to feel grateful for them. We would feel a lot more grateful if we got something that we very deeply wanted compared to getting something that we felt like we always needed to have, if that makes any sense. So maybe like every time you take something like an increase in your income, or like the ability to eat out more often, and so on and so forth, every time you take that and you flip a switch in your head so that it goes from something that you want to something that you think that you need, maybe if you do that, it causes you to become less grateful for it compared to if you perceived it as a want that is being satisfied.
Mm.
So if you get let's say that let's say that get like an e-bike or a car or something that I had always wanted, but I now think that this is something that I needed, and I'm just getting something that I need, like a basic necessity. If I'm not as grateful for it, maybe that means that the hedonic treadmill is running its course a little bit faster. Maybe the treadmill is moving at a quicker pace where any sense of gratitude that I have for it it goes away more quickly than if I said that it was something that I wanted,
Mm.
and it was something that I wanted that was very gratefully being satisfied for me. What would you
Mm.
say to that pet theory of mine?
I agree with that assessment. I know that people who actively practice gratitude and, try to actively think about how thankful they are for the things that they have do tend to be happier with their life. And, that gets recommended to people by social workers and therapists, I'm sure. So I think that you're probably right. I think that people treating a want as a need is them moving along the treadmill faster and no longer thinking to feel grateful for it in the way that they might feel thankful for a gift that they receive because it's no longer a gift, instead it's just a part of life.
So one thing that I find very interesting is that like if you were to look at the average American's mental health, their life satisfaction has actually gone down
Mm.
surprisingly over the past few decades. Like even though the standard of living has risen significantly and like so many things are cheaper now if you adjust for inflation or like wages compared to what they were in the past, like it's insane like how much cheaper like a TV is compared to how expensive it was 20 years ago. But like in spite of the fact that all of those comforts exist, one thing that I find really fascinating indeed is just the fact that, like, in spite of all of that, life satisfaction has generally gone down, and in addition to life satisfaction going down, people believe that they need much higher wages than they did in the past, even adjusting for inflation, in order to live a satisfactory life. So, how much of like people having increasingly high expectations for how much money they would need to make, how much of that is just people chasing like increasingly high highs on that hedonic treadmill since they like every time they lack gratitude for getting something it causes them to need to move faster on the treadmill.
Mm. I don't know. I think it's possible. I don't want to take the concept a bit too far, because the hedonic treadmill is just a simplification of something that we don't really understand. It's just a summarization of what we can observe with how people tend to behave. We know that people tend to be very happy about things in the short run, and then they get used to having them, and they go back to some kind of baseline with what they report they feel about their life. Um, as for how applicable that is to explaining trends in society, I don't totally know. It's something to do with whatever mechanism in the brain explains the hedonic treadmill phenomenon. Probably has something to do with the broader trend in society as well. But it's something that I think we should be careful about because there are a lot of unexpected patterns in overall societal well-being. If you look at the Great Recession, for example, you would expect there to be a very large swing in the sentiment that Americans feel toward their lives and their life satisfaction during that period, but it barely budged. If you look at surveys over time of how happy people report that they are, it barely moved around 2008, 2009, 2010. It was kind of flat, actually. I don't think that that means that, like, oh, so I guess that the Great Recession didn't really matter. No, I mean, of course it matters when lots of people become unemployed. Um, but I think that the degree to which that matters might be a bit hard to pick up in happiness statistics because that's determined by so many other things than whether or not you're employed, because it's also determined by, relationships and connections with people and how you feel about your prospects for the future and a whole long list of things.
How do you try to pursue satisfaction in your life if you have an extreme amount of wealth and willingly subject yourself to like cheap meals and like lower material prosperity compared to many other people who might use the same amount of money that you have in more like slightly more luxurious ways?
You're asking like how I try to be happy?
Yeah, like where do you get that sense of fulfillment from?
Um, I feel fulfilled whenever I write an article that does well, and that I feel good about, and that I think that I did a good job with. I feel good um, developing new relationships that I enjoy in real life, and when I go out for sushi. I like sushi. So there's some smaller comforts that I enjoy. Um, things like that. And I also think that it's important to challenge yourself, and for me to challenge myself. I find that I feel a lot better about being lazy later in the day, and like doing something fun if I've done some meaningful work earlier in the day. It doesn't feel great to be like I can do pretty much whatever I want right now. I could wake up tomorrow and I could just spend the whole day watching TV and scrolling and doing things like that. But I feel awful about it at the end of the day. So I think that it's important to try to do some meaningful work, even if it's just studying and learning something new.
Yeah. Um, what is one? What are some ways in which you wish that you could communicate the ability to study and learn something new to other people who may not be a member of the cognitive elite?
Oh, I really don't want to. I guess that we can use this cognitive elite term. Like maybe like no matter how high up you go, you're always like looking up, further. But like to me, it was always like, oh, the cognitive elite is like, you know, people who are like super insane freaks at thinking, and like, it's the people that like I've met who are like taking twice as many classes simultaneously and like know quantum physics and things like that. Like that's the cognitive elite to me, and like I was never really a part of that. But um, if you're asking like how do we like communicate these ideas about how to live well to other people, I don't know how much they should be. I don't know how helpful it'll be for other people to try to live life the way that I do. But I think it could be helpful, and if we want to communicate that, um, I don't have any special ideas for how to do that and how to say it, except I do think that lowering the barrier to entry is probably a good idea, and just say, you don't feel great right now, but then just like, give them the advice that people give to like a depressed person. Like, don't like think, oh, I'm gonna clean up the whole house today. Just do one small thing. Like, oh, I'm gonna fold one shirt and put it away. And that can start a chain reaction and like really improve your habits. And it's the same thing with, doing something challenging in order to try to feel better every day. You don't have to like do a full workout. Just like try doing 5 push-ups right now, or try just reading one article in the New York Times, if you want to like do something more cognitively demanding than you usually do. I don't know. I mean, that's not like the most cognitively demanding thing, and like that sounds kind of silly to like you or I, but like there are some people who just don't read the news or like don't really read at all. They might just scroll and talk to people, and that's it. And that's fine. I think that again, I think that it should be repeated that uh, everybody finds happiness in their own way. For some people, that'll involve more reading than others. But I do think that challenging oneself is probably generally important for people, regardless of their skill level in any domain. And it doesn't even have to be something cognitively demanding. It could be anything that you find meaningful that challenges you and forces you to stop and think, how am I going to do this? Or just to keep trying, that requires some degree of failure before you succeed, some real delayed gratification.